Welcome to the Hallowed Dead on Divine Mercy Radio, 540 AM. I'm your host, Kevin Sullivan, a medical provider by trade and an accidental journalist by circumstance. But most importantly, I'm just a layperson on my own journey with Christ. I don't speak with theological authority. I speak as an ordinary man, a man who has been greatly inspired by what I read, what I learn, and what the saints have left behind. Saints serve as archetypes of human holiness, embodying the virtues and love of Christ in their lives. They are like spiritual lighthouses, guiding us towards a deeper relationship with Jesus. By contemplating their lives and virtues, we gain inspiration and practical examples of how to live out our faith with courage, humility, and charity. They urge us towards holiness by their example, showing us that sanctity is possible for everyone, regardless of your state in life. The sun rose over Auschwitz on July 30th, 1941, without mercy. The camp siren had split the morning air before dawn had fully broken, and thousands of prisoners stumbled from their barracks into the muddy courtyard. They stood in rigid formation, silent, hollow-eyed, starving. The night before, a prisoner had escaped, and under Nazi policy, that meant one thing: 10 men would die in his place. Collective punishment. The deputy camp commander, Karl Fitch, stepped forward with cold efficiency. He didn't shout or rage, he simply began selecting men. You. Each word was a death sentence, handed out with callous indifference. One by one, the prisoners were pulled from the ranks. They were to be taken to the starvation bunker in Block 11, where they would be sealed in an underground cell and left to die, slowly, without food or water. Among the chosen was a Polish army sergeant named Franciszek Jownicek. When he heard his number called, something inside him broke. He stepped forward, trembling, and from somewhere deep within, uncontrollably, came a cry. Not of defiance, not of anger, but of pure anguish. My wife, my children. What will happen to my wife and children? The courtyard fell silent. Both prisoners and guards were astonished at the insubordination. In a place designed to strip men of names, dignity, and hope, this cry was dangerously human. It reminded everyone present that these weren't just numbers. They were family men, husbands, fathers. The guards sneered at the outburst. The selection was final. The line of men would move straight to the chambers, and those chosen would die. And then something happened that never had happened before in Auschwitz. From within the ranks, from among thousands who knew that stepping out of line meant instant death, one man quietly removed his cap. He stepped forward, not in a panic or desperation, but with calm. His name was Father Maximilian Kolbe, a Polish Franciscan friar. In that moment, standing in the courtyard soaked in terror, under the shadow of rifles and barbed wire, Father Kolbe didn't preach, he didn't protest, and he didn't condemn. He simply made a request. I am a Catholic priest, he said calmly, and I would like to take that man's place. He has a wife and children. Not long ago, someone posted an image online. It was a man standing alone before a lion. Beneath it was a question that cuts deeper the longer you sit with it. If you were told to renounce Jesus Christ or be fed to the lions, what would you do? At first, the answer feels immediate, almost instinctive. Of course I wouldn't renounce him. Of course I'd face the lions. But then you let the reality set in. The noise of the crowd, the smell of the arena, the sheer violence of what's to come. Suddenly, it's no longer theoretical. It's terrifying. And you realize this wasn't just a hypothetical. This was a real choice faced by the early Christians. Men and women not so different from us. So you start searching for a way around it. Could you say the words but not mean them? Could you renounce Christ outwardly while holding on to him inwardly? But even that falls apart, because truth matters deeply. We're not called to live divided lives, one of appearance and one of reality. Faith demands integrity, even when it costs us everything. St. Kolbe wasn't standing in an ancient arena, but he faced a decision just as real. He could have stepped back. He could have chosen survival. He could have distanced himself from his calling, from his fellow prisoners, from the path God had set before him. There were moments where a different choice might have meant living through the war, but he didn't take them. Instead, he remained, fully united with his faith and to his people. When the moment came, he didn't look for escape. He stepped forward. And that kind of courage, it's hard to comprehend. This shows up again and again in the lives of the saints, this almost otherworldly bravery, this refusal to compromise, even when the cost is unimaginable. Maybe that's the point of these stories, because most of us won't stand in an arena, we won't hear the roar of the lions, but we will face smaller moments, quiet choices, daily pressures, opportunities to bend, to compromise, to choose the easier path. And when those moments come, we remember the early Christians who walked into the arena rather than deny their faith. We remember men like St. Maximilian Kolbe, who chose unity, sacrifice, and love over self-preservation. And maybe, just maybe, that memory gives us the strength to choose rightly, even when it's hard. In a previous episode, we spoke about a warning given to the world that if humanity didn't return to God, another war would come, and it would be worse than the last. Not just another conflict, but something industrial, something that would swallow nations, and in 2 instances, vaporize an entire city in the blink of an eye. Between 1939 and 1945, the world was set on fire. Tens of millions, soldiers, civilians, children, were consumed by genocide, famine, and disease. When it ended, between 60 and 80 million people were dead. That's nearly 3% of the world's population at the time. Historical epics like that force an ancient question. How could God allow this? A theologian might answer with free will, with a fallen world, with a God who permits suffering but doesn't cause it. It's a hard answer, not a comforting one. I've heard another way of putting it, that faith isn't proven in comfort but in fire. That if we cling to God through the terror and loss, whatever we endure here will feel like a shadow compared to eternity. But while we're here, suffering is part of the deal. No one escapes it. The only choice we get is how do we respond? War, famine, sickness, they press in and reveal who we are. Do we curse God? Do we turn inward or surrender and choose love anyway? Maximilian Kolbe didn't just talk about love, he lived it. In a time that seemed to have forgotten what love even meant, he poured himself out for others until love cost him everything. Sometimes sacrifice can be small, patience, inconvenience, quiet kindness, and sometimes it's a life laid down for another. That kind of sacrifice stands like a lighthouse in the dark. His story doesn't just show us how a man died, it shows us how a man loved when loving seemed impossible. And that may be the most powerful answer to suffering the world has ever seen. Maximilian Kolbe was born Raymond Kolbe in 1894 in Zduńska Wola, a small town in what was historically Poland, but at the time existed under control of the Russian Empire. Poland had been partitioned in the late 18th century by Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and for more than a century the Polish people lived without a sovereign state. Their language was suppressed in school, their culture was monitored, their political identity was fractured. In such an environment, Catholicism wasn't merely a religious practice, it was a guardian of national memory. Parish churches preserved language, ritual, and a sense of belonging that imperial rule couldn't fully extinguish. Raymond's father, Juliusz Kolbe, was involved in Polish independence activities and would later be executed by Russian authorities for revolutionary involvement. His mother, Maria, was deeply devout and known for her seriousness about faith. Their home was disciplined but loving, patriotic but prayerful. Raymond was considered to be intelligent and intense, but also restless and occasionally difficult. His mother once confronted him about this behavior and asked in frustration what would become of him in this life. That question followed him for years, quietly shaping the man who would one day rise from that sometimes defiant boy. When Raymond was 12 years old, he experienced a vision of the Virgin Mary. The experience took place in 1906 in Pabianice, Poland. According to his later account, Mary appeared to him holding 2 crowns, one white for purity and one red for martyrdom. She asked which did he choose, and he said both. That moment deeply marked him and shaped the trajectory of his life. Whether one interprets this as a mystical encounter or formative imagination, the psychological impact this had on such a young man is undeniable. From that point forward, he believed that his life was not open-ended, it was directed, and it had a trajectory shaped for sacrifice. The following year, Franciscan friars came through his parish, recruiting boys for their minor seminary. Poland was partitioned, faith was under pressure, and the church needed young men willing to give their lives to something bigger than themselves. Raymond was only 13, and today that sounds unthinkable. But in the early 20th century Europe, it wasn't unusual. Boys entered minor seminaries in the way others entered military academies or trade school. It was formation, discipline, Latin, philosophy, prayer before dawn, a training ground for the soul. His mother gave her blessing, and the sometimes defiant boy left home. He wasn't ordained, at least not yet. This was only the beginning. Years of study, silence, obedience, intellectual rigor, they all laid before him. It would be the slow shaping of a will. It began in that minor seminary classroom, in early mornings, in a young boy learning to master himself, because long before Maximilian Kolbe walked toward the starvation bunker, a 13-year-old decided he would belong completely to God. The Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, emphasized radical poverty, humility, and joyful imitation of Christ. Their spirituality centered not on power but on self-gift. In the Franciscan tradition, self-gift is understood as a profound, intentional, and often costly act of giving oneself to God and to others, deeply rooted in the concept of kenosis, or self-emptying. It is considered the core of a Christian life, mirroring the way God gives of himself, and it represents a transformation from being self-centered to being God-centered. For a young man already captivated by the symbolism of his vision of the two crowns, the Franciscan order provided structure for his intensity. So when the 13-year-old Raymond Kolbe entered the conventual Franciscan minor seminary in Lviv, then part of Austria-Hungary, it wasn't a romantic monastery life. It was structured, disciplined, and demanding. Raymond stood out quickly. He wasn't just pious, he was intense. Teachers noticed his exceptional memory, his mathematical precision, his ability to focus long stretches without distraction. He could move effortlessly between devotion and logic, but he also had a fiery temperament. The work of those years was learning to harness that fire. At 16, he entered the novitiate and took the name Maximilian. The academics began to recede, but the interior work deepened. More silence, examination of the conscience, study of the Franciscan rule, poverty, obedience, and chastity. This is where the inner architecture is built. After professing vows, he advanced into formal philosophical studies. And that's when his superiors realized they had more than a devout friar. They had an intellect. He didn't just study theology, he dissected it. Scholastic philosophy, metaphysics, Thomistic reasoning. Europe at the time was alive with modernism, secularism, militant ideologies. The church needed thinkers. So at 18, the church sent Maximilian Kolbe to Rome. Not every seminarian was sent to Rome. Rome was for the sharpest. There he earned doctorates in philosophy and theology while the world outside trembled. Anti-clerical marches in the street, the rise of militant secularism, and soon the outbreak of World War I. He saw firsthand the intellectual and sometimes physical assault on the church. By the time he left Rome, he wasn't merely devout, he was armed, and that's what matters. Because the calm we see decades later in Auschwitz wasn't a naive faith. It was the faith of a man who had wrestled with modern philosophy, studied the great systems of thought, watched Europe fracture, and chosen belief anyways. The boy who entered at 13 was disciplined. The friar in Rome was sharpened. And when history demanded blood, it found a man already prepared. On October 16, 1917, the very day before the Bolshevik Revolution would erupt in Russia, Freemasons marched through St. Peter's Square. They carried banners depicting the Archangel Michael crushed beneath Lucifer. They chanted slogans calling for Satan to reign in the Vatican. Kolbe, now 23 years old, witnessed this while studying at the Pontifical Gregorian University. He didn't respond to these anti-Christian public displays with anger. He didn't even consider organizing a protest. Instead, he began thinking like a saint. If evil could organize itself so efficiently, why couldn't holiness? If darkness could mobilize under banners, why couldn't light? 3 days later, on October 19th, in a small Roman cell in the university, Kolbe gathered 6 fellow friars. They were young, unknown, poor, and without influence or resources. And together they founded what he called the Militia Immaculatae, or the Army of the Immaculate. This so-called militia wasn't militant in the worldly sense. It was spiritual warfare. Kolbe's idea was radical in its simplicity. Consecrate yourself entirely to the Blessed Virgin Mary, wear the miraculous medal as a sign of belonging, pray for the conversion of sinners, especially enemies of the church, and use every legitimate means possible to bring souls to Christ through Mary. As a devout Marian, he believed she was the quickest, surest, and most complete path to union with Jesus. He often said, "Never be afraid of loving the Blessed Virgin too much, for you can never love her more than Jesus did." All right, I wanted to jump in here real quickly because my Protestant friends always raise an eyebrow to the notion of Marian prayer and veneration. In Catholic theology, the distinction between worship and honor is a matter of kind, not just degree. Catholics use specific Greek-derived terms to define these boundaries and to ensure that divine adoration remains reserved for God alone. Latria, which is divine worship and adoration, is the highest form of reverence, reserved only for the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It acknowledges God as the creator and the supreme source of all life. Hyperdulia, which is a special veneration, is a uniquely elevated level of honor reserved specifically for Mary. It recognizes her unparalleled role as the Mother of God, or Theotokos. For Catholics, Mary is revered as the greatest and most perfect of all human creatures, exalted above all angels and saints. As the Immaculate Conception, conceived without original sin, she is viewed as God's masterpiece, chosen to be the mother of Jesus. She's considered the most beautiful, holy, and influential human to ever live. But we must remember, hyperdulia is veneration, not adoration, strictly distinct from the worship given to God. Dulia is the standard honor and respect given to angels and saints for their virtuous lives and friendship with God. So to wrap it up, it's vitally important to note that honoring is not worshiping. Catholics believe Mary is a human creature, not a divine being. She was saved by God's mercy and is entirely dependent on Him for her holiness. Praying to Mary is viewed as asking a spiritual mother or friend to pray to God on your behalf, similar to asking a friend on earth for prayers. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, devotion to Mary is intrinsic to Christian worship because she acts like a mirror. Her soul magnifies the Lord and always leads followers back to Jesus, never away from Him. To Saint Kolbe, being a devout Marian meant dedicating himself to a deep, intentional, and loving relationship with the Virgin Mary, viewing her as a spiritual mother, model of faith, and intercessor to Jesus Christ. This involved practicing, contemplating, and imitating her virtues, such as humility and obedience to God through prayer, rituals, and devotion. It's important to note that during Kolbe's formative years as a young friar, he became ill with tuberculosis, most likely around 1918 at the university while living in the crowded Franciscan friary. At the time, tuberculosis was widespread in Europe, especially in the densely populated urban environments and communal religious houses. It is spread easily through airborne droplets, and there were no antibiotics at the time. Sanatoriums, rest, and fresh air were the only treatments available. Kolbe's case wasn't mild. He developed advanced pulmonary tuberculosis, and at one point doctors believed he would not survive. He experienced unrelenting coughing fits, coughing up blood, severe weakness. He was so ill that his superiors questioned whether he would even be able to complete his formation. His health remained fragile permanently. After his ordination in 1918, Kolbe was sent to the sanatorium for extended recovery, including time in the Italian Alps. Later, back in Poland, he also spent periods in tuberculosis treatment facilities. These years of weakness and illness shaped him profoundly. He began speaking more intensely about total consecration to the Immaculate, offering suffering for the conversion of souls, and trust in divine providence. Most notably, and so often seen in the formation of saints, he didn't interpret his suffering as meaningless. He saw it as preparation. Physically, tuberculosis hollowed him out. Spiritually, it refined him. In 1919, Maximilian Kolbe would return to the newly reborn Poland. The country had just re-emerged after 123 years of partition. Borders were unstable, the Polish-Soviet War was brewing, ideologies were colliding in the streets. He resumed teaching at the Franciscan Seminary in Krakow, but his mind was elsewhere, on the Militia Immaculate. Originally, the militia was a spiritual counteroffensive. After witnessing the aggressive anti-Christian demonstrations in Rome, he believed those who spread anti-Christianity weren't reaching people accidentally, they were highly organized. So he decided the Catholic response must be organized too. But once back in Poland, he realized something critical. Prayer meetings weren't enough. Devotion alone would not compete with newspapers, pamphlets, political manifestos, and ideological propaganda flooding Europe after World War I. The battlefield had shifted. The modern world ran on print. Newspapers shaped public imagination, periodicals formed political identity, cheap pamphlets spread ideas faster than sermons ever could. Socialism, nationalism, they all understood the power of media. Most clergy of this era were still operating in parish-centered sacramental framework. Kolbe saw something larger. If the church did not occupy the printing press would be occupied by those hostile to her. This was an astute observation. You have to remember, Kolbe believed strongly in Marian devotion, and the basis of this devotion wasn't sentimentalism. It was spiritual strategy, but all strategies required structure. So in 1922, with permission from his superiors, he launched a small monthly publication called Right Search Nepokalane, the Night of the Immaculate. The first issue was printed under almost laughable conditions. They had no money, no proper press. They had to beg for paper. The friars helped with the layout by hand. Circulation was modest at first, a few thousand copies, but Kolbe understood scale would come in time. He simplified theology for ordinary readers. He wrote clearly, directly, and accessibly. Here are some of the notable quotes demonstrating its simple message. A single act of love makes the soul return to life. Or, let us remember that love lives through sacrifice and is nourished by giving. Without sacrifice, there is no love. He framed Catholic teaching not as defensive, but militant in love, confident, structured, and purposeful. The content wasn't niche devotional writing, it was apologetics, catechesis, cultural engagement, Marian spirituality, and defense of the faith. Within a decade, circulation would explode into hundreds of thousands, eventually reaching over 1 million, making it one of the largest Catholic publications in the world. He was evangelizing Catholicism, and it worked. Despite the astounding success of this publication, Kolbe wasn't content. He dared to dream even bigger. With permission from his superiors and support from Prince Jadrudzki Lubecki, land was donated near Warsaw. There, Kolbe founded a monastery unlike any other. He named it Niepokalanów, the City of the Immaculate, and it's one of the more remarkable monastic projects of the 20th century. Much of it truly began with almost no infrastructure at all. The land donated by Prince Jan was essentially empty farmland near the village of Terezin in central Poland. It wasn't a developed estate, not even particularly useful land. It was mainly open fields with marshy and sandy soil. There were no permanent buildings, no infrastructure, and only basic rural access roads. The earliest structures on the land were extremely primitive, nothing more than a hodgepodge of wooden barracks and army surplus huts. Initially, there was little electricity, water had to be drawn manually, heating was minimal. The friars did much of the construction themselves. They lived almost like pioneers on the frontier. Kolbe never intended Niepokalanów to be a quiet monastery. His vision was industrial-scale evangelization. The friars began constructing printing halls, workshops, living quarters, a chapel, storage buildings. Within a few years, the monastery was running a large printing operation, producing thousands of copies of Right Search Nepokalane. With this new infrastructure, circulation exploded. At first in the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, and eventually over 1 million copies. By the mid-1930s, the once empty field had become a Catholic media powerhouse, but also an enormous religious complex. At the time, it was considered the largest monastery in the world. Kolbe drove the project with unusual intensity while still living the Franciscan religious life. In Niepokalanów, Kolbe pushed technological boundaries. He explored using film, he pursued radio evangelization, he dreamed of a global Catholic media network decades before the concept even existed. He once said, "The modern world must be conquered for Christ, and the printing press is the machine gun, not of violence, but of truth." Millions of copies of Right Search Nepokalane spread across Poland. Most people who saw their goals not only achieved, but went above and beyond their expectations, would have been satisfied. Not Maximilian Kolbe. Because in his mind, the mission had never been about evangelizing Europe. It was about evangelizing the world. In early 1930, Kolbe gathered several friars and told them something that must have sounded completely insane. They were going to Japan. None of them spoke Japanese. No money, no mission waiting for them. But Kolbe believed devotion to the Virgin Mary, spread through modern media, could reach every nation. So in February of that year, Maximilian Kolbe boarded a ship and began a month-long journey across half the planet. His destination? The port city of Nagasaki. Nagasaki wasn't a random choice. For centuries, it had been the center of Christianity in Japan. Missionaries had once flourished there after the arrival of Francis Xavier in the 1500s. However, by the 1600s, Christianity had been brutally suppressed. Thousands of believers had been executed. For over 2 centuries, the faith survived only in secret, carried by what historians called the hidden Christians. By the time Kolbe arrived in 1930, Christianity had returned, but it was still very small. When the friars first stepped off the ship in Nagasaki, reality hit immediately. They had almost nothing, no house, no land, no printing equipment, or any knowledge of the language. They began by renting a small wooden home in the outskirts of the city. The friars were busy inside those cramped quarters. They began learning Japanese, celebrating Mass, and sketching plans for a Japanese version of Right Search Nepokalane. The first big challenge was communication. Japanese was incredibly difficult for the Polish missionaries, but Kolbe refused to delay the project until they were fluent. As a result, he relied heavily on local help. A few Japanese Catholics began assisting the friars with translation and editing. Amazingly, within only a few months, the first issue of the new magazine appeared. Its title, Seibo no Kishi, The Night of the Immaculate, printed in Japanese. At all odds, the publication began gaining readers, and before they knew it, the little missionary house was far too small. Kolbe needed land. In 1939, he found it on the side of a hill overlooking Nagasaki. Like its predecessor, Neopokalanów, it wasn't an ideal site. In fact, many people thought it was a terrible choice. The land sat on the side of a mountain ridge far away from the city center. Some warned that the location was impractical, but Kolbe insisted. He believed that the location was exactly where it needed to be. So on that hillside, he began building his vision, a place he named Mugenzai no Sono, a name which meant the Garden of the Immaculate. Construction was humble at first, simple wooden buildings, workshops, a chapel, living quarters for the friars. But as in Poland, Kolbe's vision was larger than a simple monastery. He wanted a missionary publishing center. Printing presses were acquired, paper shipments were arranged, and local Catholics joined the effort. Soon, the presses of Mugenzai no Sono were printing thousands of copies of the Japanese Catholic magazine each month. It truly became the Neopokalanów reborn in Asia. In 1936, after 6 years in Japan, his health, still damaged by chronic tuberculosis, forced him to return to Poland. But by then, the mission had taken root. A Japanese monastery, a Catholic printing press, a Marian movement spreading through a culture completely foreign to the young friar who had arrived with almost nothing. It was another impossible project that somehow became real. And it would not be the last time Maximilian Kolbe built something extraordinary in the shadow of catastrophe. Maximilian Kolbe returned to Poland in 1936 and resumed his work at Neopokalanów. What he couldn't have known was that in a few short years, evil itself would arrive at its gates. Throughout the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler had been formulating his expansionist ideology. Austria had already been absorbed, and then came the Sudetenland. Europe protested but did little. To clear the path for the next move, Hitler signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, a non-aggression agreement that had secretly carved Eastern Europe between the two powers. Then, on August 31st, 1939, the Nazis staged a deception. SS operatives posing as Polish fighters attacked a radio station in Gliwice. The next morning, Germany invaded Poland. Hitler's blitzkrieg was overwhelming. Within days, Great Britain and France abandoned appeasement and declared war on Germany, setting the world on the path for total conflict. As German forces swept across Poland, the great Franciscan city of Neopokalanów, now the largest Franciscan monastery in the world, suddenly found itself under a ruthless occupation. To the Nazis, places like Neopokalanów were dangerous. They were centers of Polish faith, identity, and intellectual life. Within weeks, soldiers arrived at the gates. The presses that once thundered with Marian publications suddenly fell silent. The monastery was searched, work was halted. Many friars were arrested. Kolbe himself was taken with them. He and roughly 40 brothers were transported through a series of temporary detention camps, where Polish clergy and intellectuals were held under harsh conditions. Their goal was intimidation, neutralization. For months, they endured confinement as the Nazis worked to dismantle the monastery's influence. Then something unexpected happened. On December 8, 1939, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, Kolbe was released from Auschwitz. The reasoning remained unclear, possibly administrative shuffling, lack of formal charges, or even his partially German surname. But one thing was clear, it wasn't due to mercy. He returned to Neopokalanów to find a community shattered and the monastery partially occupied by German forces. But Kolbe didn't retreat into silence. For the next 14 months, he transformed the monastery into a refuge. Buildings became makeshift hospitals. The friars sheltered displaced families and the wounded. Most remarkably, Kolbe opened the gates to roughly 2,000 Polish Jews fleeing persecution. They were given food, clothing, and medical care, an act that carried enormous risk under Gestapo scrutiny. Even though the Nazis had banned his large-scale publishing operations, Kolbe somehow managed to obtain permission for a single final issue of Right Search in December of 1940. Between the lines, he warned that the Nazi New World Order was an assault on Judeo-Christian souls. The message slipped past the censors, strengthening morale among Poles living under occupation. But it also drew attention. Early in the occupation, Kolbe had been offered a chance to escape persecution. Because of his German-sounding last name, officials suggested he should sign the Deutsche Volkliste, the registry that classified people as ethnic Germans and granted them protection. Kolbe outright refused. He chose to remain identified with the occupied Polish people. From that moment forward, he carried a large target on his back. Interestingly, witnesses remembered his strange calm during those months. He spent long hours in prayer and quietly warned the friars that they must be ready to suffer for truth. That leadership held the community together as the Nazi general government tightened its grip on Poland. Then, on February 17, 1941, the Gestapo returned. They arrested Kolbe and several companions and transported them to Pawiak prison, a brutal interrogation and transit prison in Warsaw. Conditions there were savage, overcrowding, starvation, and daily beatings. Witnesses later said that Kolbe was repeatedly assaulted for being a priest. Guards mocked him, they tore at his Franciscan habit, and demanded he renounce his vocation, yet he never did. Even in prison, he quietly ministered to the inmates around him, hearing confessions, sharing his meager rations, and encouraging the other men who were slowly sinking into despair. His captors saw a frail, sickly friar. They didn't realize who they were dealing with, a man who had already surrendered his life years earlier. 3 months later, on May 28, 1941, Kolbe was forced into a crowded cattle car with 300 other prisoners and transported to the infamous Auschwitz concentration camp. When the doors opened, his name disappeared. His head was shaved, his clothes were stripped away, and he became prisoner number 16670. The guards quickly discovered he was a priest, which made him a prime target for punishment. He was assigned brutal labor, hauling stones and heavy timber. One guard in particular, known amongst the prisoners as the Bloody Krot, seemed to take pleasure in tormenting him. One afternoon, Krot forced Kolbe to carry massive planks until he collapsed. When he could no longer stand, Krot beat him and left him in the mud for dead. But Kolbe didn't die. Other prisoners carried him to the camp hospital, a place most men entered only to breathe their last breath. Instead of resting, Kolbe spent his recovery moving from bunk to bunk in the darkness. He listened to confessions and shared what little bread he had. And then he repeated the same words to the men around him. Hatred is not a creative force. Only love is a creative force. For 2 months, 16670 was a ghost of a man. He was barely clinging to life, but also anchoring the spirits of everyone in Block 14. The sun rose over Auschwitz on July 30th, 1941, without mercy. The camp siren had split the morning air before dawn had fully broken, and thousands of prisoners stumbled from their barracks into the muddy courtyard. The gravel bit into bare and blistered feet. The smell of unwashed bodies mingled with smoke from the crematoria. Guards barked orders in German, rifle bolts clicked. A prisoner from Kolbe's work detail had gone missing. In Auschwitz, an escape or even the suspicion of one triggered an immediate retaliation. The SS would call the prisoners into the courtyard for a punishment roll call that stretched for hours under the sun. Eventually, the deputy camp commander, Karl Fritz, announced the sentence. 10 men would die by starvation. This was a policy of calculated terror. The Nazis believed that collective punishment would crush any thought of escape. Prisoners stood rigid in formation while Fritz walked slowly down the rows, selecting victims at random. You. Step out. Each gesture was a death sentence. One of the men chosen was Polish Army Sergeant Franciszek Gigiewniczek. When he heard his number called, something broke inside of him. Witnesses recalled him crying out in despair, "My wife, my children, what will happen to my wife and children?" The guards showed no reaction. In the machinery of Auschwitz, family meant nothing. The condemned men were assembled and prepared to be marched away. Then something happened that no one had ever seen before. From within the ranks, a prisoner stepped forward. It was Father Maximilian Kolbe. He removed his cap and brought it to his side and calmly approached the SS officer. In Auschwitz, stepping out of line like this could mean being shot on the spot, but Kolbe stood quietly before Fritz and spoke. "I am a Catholic priest," he said. "I want to take that man's place. He has a wife and children." For a moment, the courtyard froze. The request made no sense within the logic of the camp. Prisoners often fought desperately to survive. They stole bread from one another. They even betrayed each other for scraps. But this man was volunteering to die for a total stranger. After a brief pause, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of contempt, Fritz agreed. Sergeant Gigiewniczek was returned to the line. Kolbe took his place among the condemned. The 10 prisoners were then marched underground to a starvation cell, the Block 11, the punishment block of Auschwitz. The starvation bunker was a dark concrete chamber designed to kill slowly. Prisoners were locked inside without food or water and left to die over the course of days or even weeks. But what unfolded in there surprised even the guards. According to testimony from prisoners working nearby, instead of screams or madness, voices began to rise from the cell. Prayers, hymns. Kolbe, already weakened by months of brutal labor, led the condemned men in the rosary and in quiet prayer. Guards passing the corridor repeatedly heard the voices echoing through the bunker. Sometimes loud, sometimes faint, but always steady. One by one, as intended by the cruel punishment, the prisoners died. Days passed, then weeks. The starvation cells were normally cleared quickly, but Kolbe refused to die. And then finally, after 2 weeks, only he remained alive. On August 14th, 1941, the vigil of the Feast of the Assumption, the guards decided to end it. A camp orderly entered the cell and injected Kolbe with carbolic acid. He died shortly after. His body was taken to the crematorium, but the man whose place he had taken, Sergeant Gajovnicek, survived the camp and the war. And for the rest of his life, he would tell the world about the priest who stepped forward in Auschwitz and chose to die so that he could live. Sacrifice. It's a word we use often but rarely stop to truly weigh. In the teachings of Jesus Christ, it stands at the very center of what it means to love. He didn't just speak of sacrifice, he embodied it, willing to offer himself for the sake of all mankind. And when he gave his greatest commandment, to love thy neighbor, he was in many ways calling us into a life marked by that same quiet surrender. Because real love is costly, and it asks something of us. It shows up in the small, unseen moments. The time we give our children when we're exhausted. The patience we extend when it would be easier to turn away. The resources we offer, even when it stretches us thin. These are the daily sacrifices, ordinary, often unnoticed, but deeply meaningful. Each one a decision to place someone else before ourselves. And that's not easy, to choose last place, to set aside our own comfort, our own desires. It takes strength, a different kind of strength, the kind rooted not in power but in humility. Most of us will never be asked to make the ultimate sacrifice, to lay down our lives for another. That kind of moment is rare, but it's the very foundation of Christ's passion and the highest expression of love. It's also the life lived by St. Maximilian Kolbe. Yes, the world remembers him for the moment he stepped forward in a Nazi death camp, and rightly so. But that final act wasn't sudden. It was a culmination of a life already given away. Long before that day, St. Maximilian had been sacrificing. As a young man, he surrendered personal ambition. As a priest, he poured out his time, his energy, his very being for others, building communities, spreading faith, and serving whoever stood in front of him. His life was a steady rhythm of giving, shaped by a love that refused to keep anything for itself. And so when the moment came when sacrifice demanded everything, he was ready. Because for Maximilian Kolbe, laying down his life wasn't a single act. It was a lifetime of choosing love. Christian theology insists that love must be freely chosen. Free will is the condition for moral meaning. Totalitarian systems, on the other hand, seek to erase free will by overwhelming individuals with fear. Auschwitz was purposely constructed to reduce human beings to their basic instincts. Kolbe disrupted that design. By volunteering his life, he demonstrated that even in near-total coercion, interior freedom remained. He affirmed that dignity is not granted by the state, it's intrinsic. In 1982, Pope John Paul II canonized him as a martyr of charity. That designation matters. Kolbe was not executed explicitly for preaching, he died for another person. His martyrdom would expand the category from ideological witness to sacrificial love. Franciszek Gajovnicek survived the war and lived until 1995. He attended Kolbe's canonization. One life extended because another was surrendered. History remembers conquerors and generals, but in a concrete cell beneath Auschwitz, a frail piece demonstrated something tyrannies couldn't comprehend: that love, freely chosen, is stronger than fear. St. Maximilian Kolbe's life was not a sudden blaze of heroism. It was decades of disciplined surrender, culminating in a single, irreversible act. The boy who chose 2 crowns grew into the man who wore them. And his story forces us to ask not what we would do in a starvation bunker, but what we are doing now with the freedoms we possess. Because martyrdom is rare, but self-gift is daily. And history, in the end, will be shaped less by those with power than by those who quietly decide that love is worth the cost. August 9th, 1945, Nagasaki, Japan. 4 years after St. Maximilian Kolbe walked into the starvation bunker at Auschwitz, the world stood on edge of a different kind of horror. In the Japanese city of Nagasaki, the morning was clear. Church bells rang, laundry hung on the sun. Priests and brothers of a small Franciscan monastery had already finished Mass and began their daily work. Then suddenly, at 11:02 a.m., the sky ignited. A single atomic bomb detonated above the city, unleashing heat hotter than the surface of the sun, a shockwave traveling faster than sound, with a force capable of leveling entire cities in seconds. In an instant, Nagasaki was erased. Tens of thousands of people were vaporized where they stood. Buildings collapsed like paper, fires consumed what the blast did not. The cathedral at Urukame, once the largest church in Asia, was obliterated. Death fell from the sky, and yet, just outside the heart of the blast zone, something remained standing. On the hillside overlooking the ruined city stood a Franciscan monastery, Mugenzai no Sono, the Garden of the Immaculate. Remarkably, the walls were intact. The roof still stood. The windows were shattered, but the structure remained. And inside were the friars, alive, unburned, and unbroken. This is the same monastery that had been built years early under St. Maximilian, during his missionary years in Japan. You may remember that against local advice, he insisted on placing it behind a natural shield of the mountain, trusting not engineering calculations, but divine providence. That decision saved every life inside. Later measurements showed that the monastery sat well within the range where total destruction should have occurred. Nearby structures were flattened, human shadows were burned into stone. Radiation sickness claimed countless lives in the days and the weeks that followed. But the friars who lived and prayed in that house suffered none of it. No radiation sickness, no lasting injuries, no deaths. Doctors couldn't explain it, scientists couldn't explain it. But the men who lived there knew exactly what they were seeing. They were living in the shadow of a martyr. The saint who had once stepped forward in a prison yard to die for a total stranger had, years earlier, built a home consecrated to the Immaculate Virgin, a place of prayer, sacrifice, and trust. And that house still stood when fire fell from the sky. At Auschwitz, St. Maximilian had offered his life so another might live. At Nagasaki, it seemed heaven answered with a sign. That love stronger than death is never lost, that sacrifice is never wasted, and that a man who gave his life completely to God does not disappear into history. He echoes in prison yards, in ruined cities, in monasteries that refuse to fall. So it was clear, St. Maximilian Kolbe didn't stop loving the world when he died. And if someday we face the same immeasurable cruelty and destruction, maybe we'll ask, where is God in all of this? And the answer is simple. He never left us at all. You have been listening to the Hallowed Dead on Divine Mercy Radio 540 AM. New episodes will air every second Friday of each month. If you missed any part of the program, episodes are available on demand at divinemercyradio.org. Click Listen, then Local Programs. Wherever you're struggling, remember that others have walked this road before you. Let the saints remind you that perseverance can become glory.